Thank you for watching. Welcome to We the Govern. My name is Glenn Morgan, and today we're going to be focusing on election results in Washington State now that we've got a whole bunch more ballots that have come in, and the results look a little bit better for Republicans. Hi, we're back to Washington State, and we're going to be discussing the election results from 2020. Now, we did a recap just the day after the election, which was about a week ago, but now that the rest of the mail-in ballots have been counted, and it was about 750,000 or so that have been counted, we actually have a little bit more information to report. And generally, the main takeaway at this point in time is that Republicans have done much better than it looked like they were going to do on the day after the election, a week ago when we reported on this. So the question is, what happened and who benefited from these late ballots as they were coming in? Now, that's the big thing in Washington State. We are entirely vote by mail, so the delay, and we accept ballots long after Election Day, as long as they've been theoretically postmarked before Election Day. And in this case, we have so far counted about 750,000 ballots. And we indicated that would be the case about a week ago when we first did this. And since that time, in the last week, we are up to about 4 million ballots total that have been counted. That's an 82% participation rate. We expect another 70, could be about 100,000 more ballots to count as they kind of the last ones trickle in. But at this point in time, the results are pretty much set. There might be some little changes in some close counties, but basically in some other close races. But this is pretty much what we're looking at. And again, not a big change for president. This wasn't a state that was considered a battleground state. Biden handily won Washington State, as the mainstream media gleefully announced a few seconds after election results were initially announced last Tuesday. But so we didn't expect too much change there, but you did see a bit of a change in the governor's race, where Inslee still won, and Republican challenger Lauren Culp did not prevail, but the gap between them changed quite a bit. Lauren on election night looked like Culp looked like he was down about 40%, and now he's getting close to 43%. So there was a bit of a change there. Now, unfortunately for the voters of Washington, that still means that we are stuck with Governor Inslee, or as he has been affectionately nicknamed in eastern Washington and other places throughout Washington State, as Maggot Man, since he ever since he went out and delivered maggoty apples to fire victims in eastern Washington, and actually got some news coverage for that at the time. Now, the other thing that his office, if you are paying attention to Inslee's office, a change that has occurred just in the last couple days, is his chief of staff, now former chief of staff, David Postman, has left Olympia, and they decided to go to the other Washington, D.C. to help with the Biden campaign's transition team. And this, again, is kind of an indication of what most political observers believe is going to happen with Inslee, is that he's angling for some kind of a political job in the other D.C. David Postman has been a fixture in the Inslee administration for quite some time. He's the guy that tells Inslee what to think and do, and really helps him in figuring out what he's going to be doing as governor. And so it's likely that Inslee may follow Postman, or that there's some indication that that change is going to be an impact on Inslee's future. Now, when we still look across the state on Republican results, Kim Wyman, the Secretary of State, who's Republican, was reelected, and she was reelected pretty convincingly with a 53.4% majority. That is a significant majority for a Republican, and the only Republican who is elected a statewide office in Washington State, and I believe on the west coast of the United States right now. So she kind of holds a unique position. Sometimes Republicans consider her the unicorn candidate for the Republican Party. But it's kind of interesting when you actually look at the overall results, who voted for Republicans and for Democrats, just kind of how the state divides up. By county, which is the dominant way that we record election results in Washington State, this is how the map kind of looks right now. It may change a little bit with Clallam County and Skagit County up there because of the number of ballots coming in still to be counted in Skagit, which seem to be lean heavily Republican, and the handful of ballots still left in Clallam. There's only about 100 vote, a little less than 100 vote gap at this point in time, so that might change as well. But generally, this is how it lays out. These are the counties in red that voted for Culp, counties in blue voted for Inslee. However, if you look at this map and compare it on the Wyman side, you'll see that for Kim Wyman, a larger number of counties went for Wyman and in a larger percentage, and also it kind of identifies really clearly the deep blue counties, the counties that are Democrat or socialist that lean that way dramatically. You have Whatcom County in the north, which is where Western Washington University is located and dominates the city of Bellingham up there. You have King County, of course, dominated by Seattle, and then Jefferson County and San Juan County, which are largely just bedroom communities for billionaires in the King County area, and the wealthy people go there to hang out, and that they tend to vote very left-leaning, although they don't have big populations. And that kind of matches how voters tend to vote in Washington State when it comes to something that has no party affiliation, that's more of a recognition of policy focus. In this case, in Washington State, there are advisory votes that it was something approved by voter initiative where the citizens of Washington State get the ability to vote and say whether they like a tax that had been approved by the legislature and signed by the governor. A number of these were on the ballot here at the same time, and as you can see, a very small geographical population and a very small population in general like the taxes the legislature passed, and the counties that tend to support the tax increases closely match the counties that do vote Democrat. King, Jefferson, and San Juan County, obviously there. Most of the tax increases that the legislature did this last cycle in the advisory votes were actually voted, the majority of Washingtonians voted against them. So from a Republican strategy standpoint, if you're going to look at all these counties, I kind of put stars in the counties that it seems like the Republicans, if they do a good job and they run the right campaigns, they run the right candidates, they run the right issues, these are places that they have the ability to make a pretty significant difference and flip to be more Republican, or at least more Republican policy friendly. So it's worth really looking at those. And again, just with the caveat that Skagit and Clown may already be Republican when the last little batch of ballots are counted. But this is just nothing that I'm presenting here is unknown. This is going to be what political consultants probably focus on as they read the tea leaves post-election, but it's kind of worth looking at. Now, one thing I get when I am all over Eastern Washington or I speak to areas and they talk about how there's no Republicans in the state on the west side of Washington, but I do think it's important to just look at the math. King County is the largest populated county in Washington State. When it comes to voters, roughly 30% of all the voters in Washington live in King County. And what's interesting about that is that also represents the largest concentration of Republican voters in the state. They do get outvoted by the Democrats, but 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 voters who vote Republican live in King County. And that is a mathematical fact that's actually stayed fairly consistent for quite a few decades now. So there's a lot of Republican voters there. Now, for the Democrats, of course, King County represents 40% of their vote base statewide. That's a big deal. Much more important to them in that area, but it's also an opportunity for Republicans if they do a better job, I think, reaching out or motivating or getting people to vote. Now, that little red highlight you see in King County, I left that in there. That's Newcastle, the city of Newcastle. That's where I grew up originally before it was a city, but I highlighted that on this map, so that's why there's a little red over there. And when you really look at the 3 big population counties in the state, which are Snohomish, King, and Pierce, and that represents about 41 to 47% of all Republican voters, just the Republican voters in the state. Almost 1 in 2, 50% of all Republican voters live in one of those 3 counties. And for the Democrats, that's 60% of their voting base that lives there. And I think it's just important to remember that. If you look at the voters in those counties, there's more Republican voters there than there are in all of Eastern Washington combined. And I think that it's just kind of important to kind of keep that in mind, that there are a tremendous amount of Republican voters on the west side of the state that they may get outvoted in their local jurisdiction, but cumulatively they make a pretty big impact at the state level. And I put this up as well, just kind of a heat map so you can kind of look at. If it's dark red, that's 58% or more that Republican. So you see some very strong Republican votes down in southwest Washington as well as in eastern Washington. And then the light red I did from basically just over 50% to 56%. That would be Republican. And the same on the Democrat side. Light blue is lightly Republican. Deep blue is 58% or Democrat. Deep blue is heavy Democrat or socialist leaning. And so it's just worth looking at this so that we can see results and see how people are voting. Now, that doesn't change the fact that the Republicans did very, very well, and even better than it looked on election day in the 19th Legislative District in Southwest Washington. The Republicans took, Jim Walsh was reelected to his House seat, But more significantly, the Republicans picked up the Senate seat in that district, and they picked up the other House seat, state House seat. So the Republicans needed these pickups, and they did very well. I mean, very dominant performance by Republicans in that district, and it really does seem to have indicated that the Southwest Washington 19th Legislative District has clearly shifted into the Republican category pretty dramatically at this point in time. But the other people that I'd spoken about, some of the other legislators that were fighting for their political lives on Election Day, it looks like things have changed for them. Specifically, Vicki Kraft was one that I was talking about. She's in Clark County in the 17th Leg District. She was looking like she was quite a ways behind on election night, but these late-breaking ballots have tended to shift Republican, and she's pretty comfortably ahead. I mean, she would never want to say she's comfortably ahead, I'm sure, but it looks pretty good, and the trend's been going in her direction. Same with further north, up in the 10th Legislative District, Senator Ron Mazzal is also doing well. He's come back from a deficit on election night and looks like he's fairly comfortably ahead. And somebody I didn't even talk about last week, which is in the same legislative district, legislator Greg Gilday, running for his office, also came from an even bigger deficit, and it looks like he's ahead and looks like he's going to do pretty well. And so that means that assuming this is what happens, and assuming the Republicans lose the Steve O'Bannon seat, Senate seat in South Pierce County, which is a shame, and assuming they lose Luann seat up in North Whatcom County in the 42nd Leg District, that generally the Republicans kind of keep the same. They really stay static as far as their overall representation in Olympia. They same number of seats in the House, same number of seats in the Senate. Still in the minority, but they haven't lost anything in Washington State. The other thing that's quite a bit different from what I discussed last week was the infighting going on in the Democrat Party as they're purging all members of their party who hold elected office who might have the unfortunate ability to understand math or appreciate business, or who don't want the cities to go too bad down the drain. They've been now purging those people. Zach Hudgens in the 11th Leg District down in Renton was clearly defeated, but also Mark Mullet, who is a more moderate Democrat who's in the 5th Legislative District outside basically the Issaquah area, kind of that eastern King County. And there was a tremendous fight in his race. Inslee actually came in and endorsed his opponent, and his opponent got a ton of money. It was a lot of money was spent in that race. And he looked it looked like he was going to be quite a ways down on election night. He's come back and is just barely ahead. It's a razor-thin margin. It's not outside the margin of King County's typical fraud profile, so he could actually lose that race still, but it does look a little bit better for him than it did on election night. It doesn't really change the balance of power as far as party control in Olympia, but it would mean that if he stays in office, there's at least one Senate vote that occasionally would go with logic and math and reason. So that's kind of an interesting just analysis there. Now, statewide, the Republicans did not do well. Anybody who lost on election night is still losing. They have closed the gap, most of them, and they're not losing by as much, but they're still losing. The other thing that was kind of interesting was this massive write-in campaign, which I believe is the largest in state history for the lieutenant governor's seat. Josh Freed ran just this very short-lived sort of campaign as a write-in, and it didn't really change the outcome in the lieutenant governor's race. We don't believe it did, but it was still 20% of all the voters who got their ballots wrote his name in, and that ended up being about 725,000 ballots, it looks like, and that's a big deal from a wonkish kind of policy standpoint. I've never seen it happen before. I don't think it's happened in Washington State history, so that was kind of an interesting thing just to be aware of. Another issue that I did watch pretty closely was how many conservative commissioners looked like they were down and out on election night, and over the last week, there's enough votes that have come in and made a big impact. Skagit County is the most obvious, but also Thurston County, where on election night, incumbent Gary Edwards, who's an independent, but oftentimes viewed as more conservative, had a huge challenger that was a Democrat running against him with a lot of money. Looked like he was down about 4,600 votes on election night. Now he looks like he's comfortably ahead. There are more ballots to count, but it does look like it's going in the right direction. So at the end of the day, the question is, what can you do? This is how elections have gone, and some people are depressed because their candidate didn't win. Other people are happy their candidate won. But generally, if you're a conservative, liberty-oriented person, what can you do? And again, I'm going to emphasize this. Stay engaged, pay attention, build your network of support locally. You can't make too much of a difference in D.C., but you can make a huge difference where you live if you get involved and get engaged now. The other thing that really did seem to stand out, and I think this is really worth doing just a separate focus later, but if you are going to be recruiting candidates or interested in getting people to run for office locally, there was a very big difference on the Republican side between candidates who had had a lot of community history. They had built up a community background and experience and effort and making some kind of a difference in their community that they were involved in. Candidate with that profile running versus somebody who discovered on filing week that they wanted to run for office as a Republican, there were sometimes between a 3 and a 7% difference in the outcome. Whether they lost or they won, there was a big difference. And I think that's something that's important for people to realize. Republicans tend not to pay attention to local government. They just don't. It's liberty-oriented people don't want the government coming in and telling them what to do. So because of that, we tend not to pay attention to what the government's doing. And usually we get involved and engaged when we think the government's gone off the rails or things are even, gotten out of control. But if you haven't spent the time getting to know your community and becoming involved, you have a much steeper climb in order to be successful. And so Republicans are a lot more amateurish when they approach this compared to the Democrats. And it's just something to keep in mind that will make a big difference if you're heavily involved in your community and the election outcomes. No guarantees, but it does make a difference. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more, go to wethegovern.com. Don't forget to subscribe, to share, and like. If you think I missed something, just add your comment below. I do read them all, and I try to respond to as many as I can. And remember, the future does belong to those who show up.